My name is Elena, I'm 50 years old now. And this is the first time I'm telling this story honestly, without softening it, without justifying myself, without pretending I understood what was happening while it was destroying me. For most of my life, I believed endurance was love. I believed loyalty meant silence. I believed that if you stayed long enough, patient enough, kind enough, everything would eventually make sense. I was wrong. From the outside, my life looked settled, respectable, finished. A long marriage, 2 grown children, a house filled with memories, a woman who did everything right. People used words like strong, reliable, grounded to describe me. What they didn't see was how invisible I had become, even to myself. I met my husband when I was 26. I was a brunette with sharp eyes and restless hands, the kind of woman who laughed easily but carried an unspoken seriousness beneath it. I wanted depth, meaning, a life that felt intentional. He was calm, predictable. After a childhood filled with instability, safety felt like love. We built a life quickly. Marriage, children, routines that became rituals. Responsibilities that stacked quietly on my shoulders until I stopped noticing their weight. For a long time I told myself this was what fulfillment looked like. But somewhere in my late 30s something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a slow dulling. Conversations became transactional. Touch became functional. Affection turned into habit. I didn't feel mistreated. Felt unnecessary. Became the organizer, the caretaker, the emotional manager of the household. The woman who remembered everything so no one else had to. And slowly, without realizing it, I stopped being asked how I felt. Because I stopped volunteering the truth. I learned to shrink gracefully. To smooth over disappointment with understanding, to translate neglect into stress, explain absence as exhaustion. I told myself, this is marriage. This is adulthood. This is what longevity costs. And for years that belief kept me quiet. The moment that changed everything wasn't dramatic. It was painfully ordinary. I was standing in the kitchen one evening, washing dishes, watching my reflection in the dark window. The woman staring back at me looked older than 50, not in age but in spirit. Her eyes were alert but tired, alive but muted. I remember thinking, when did I stop feeling like a person and start feeling like infrastructure? That thought scared me more than any argument ever could. Around that time my children started building lives of their own. They didn't need me the way they once did. And for the first time I was left alone with the marriage itself, without motherhood to soften its emptiness. That's when the silence grew louder. I didn't plan to disrupt anything. I wasn't looking for excitement, I wasn't searching for romance, I wasn't unhappy enough to justify leaving, at least not by anyone else's standards. I was just tired of being emotionally unclaimed. Then came the invitation. Professional conference. 3 days. Another city. I almost didn't go. But something inside me whispered, go. If only to remember who you are outside this house. That's where I met Michael. Not in a cinematic way. We were seated next to each other during a panel discussion. He made a quiet observation that made me laugh. A real laugh, the kind that surprises you. He was attentive without being intrusive. Curious without being invasive. And when he asked me what I did, he didn't interrupt my answer. That alone felt unfamiliar. We talked over coffee between sessions. Then dinner. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing charged. Just conversation that felt awake. He asked questions that didn't require performance. He listened like my words mattered beyond politeness. At one point he said something simple. You seem like someone who's used to holding everything together. I didn't answer. Because I didn't know how to explain how accurate that was without unraveling. That night, alone in my hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and cried. Not because I wanted him, but because I realized how long it had been since anyone saw me. When I returned home, nothing had changed. And yet everything had. My husband asked about the trip. I gave neutral answers. Life resumed. But something inside me refused to go back to sleep. I started noticing things I had trained myself not to see. How rarely my husband looked at me when I spoke. How often I minimized my needs before expressing them. How my presence had become expected, not cherished. The realization wasn't explosive. It was devastating in its clarity. I wasn't invisible because he was cruel. I was invisible because the marriage no longer required me to be visible. And I had agreed to that role. Michael didn't disappear after the conference. We exchanged a few professional messages. Then a few personal ones. Nothing romantic. Nothing explicit. Just connection. And that frightened me more than desire ever could. Because it made me ask a question I had avoided for decades. If this is what being seen feels like, what have I been living without? By the time I turned 50, I understood something painful and liberating. I wasn't standing at the end of my life. I was standing at the edge of a truth I could no longer ignore. And I hadn't yet decided what it would cost me to honor it. In the next part, I'll tell you about the moment I crossed the line I swore I never would, and why it didn't feel like betrayal at all. After the conference, I told myself I would compartmentalize. That was my specialty. I had spent decades learning how to place emotions into neat, labeled boxes so life could continue uninterrupted. I believed I could do the same with Michael. Connection, yes, that a pleasant anomaly. Nothing more. At least, that's what I told myself. At home, I tried to be more present. I cooked elaborate dinners. I asked my husband about his day. Not out of duty, but with effort. I suggested small changes. Walks after dinner, weekends away, moments of intention. He agreed politely. But nothing shifted. Our marriage wasn't broken. It was preserved, like something sealed long ago. No longer alive but still intact. I realized then that effort alone cannot resurrect mutual desire. Michael and I continued to exchange messages. First, they were sparse and professional. Then came the subtle shift. How was your week, really? Do you ever feel like time is moving faster than your sense of self? What do you miss most about who you used to be? Questions like that don't flirt. They expose. And I answered them honestly, cautiously but truthfully. I didn't tell him everything, but I told him enough. One evening, he sent a message that stayed with me longer than it should have. You don't speak like someone who's unfinished. You speak like someone who's been paused. I stared at the screen for a long time, because I had never found language that precise for my own experience. I started noticing how differently my body responded to his presence, even digitally. I wasn't giddy, that I wasn't infatuated, I was alert. Alive in a way that felt grounded, not reckless. That scared me. Not because it felt wrong, but because it felt right in a way I had forgotten was possible. I tried to talk to my husband. Not confrontationally. Not accusing. Just honestly. I told him I felt lonely. Not alone but unseen. He listened. He nodded. He said he understood. And then he returned to the same patterns as if the conversation had never happened. That was the moment I understood something devastating. Understanding without action is another form of absence. The guilt crept in quietly. Who was I to want more? I had stability, history, shared memories. I wasn't being mistreated. I wasn't abandoned. I wasn't unsafe. But there's a kind of starvation that doesn't bruise the skin. It erodes the soul instead. And I had been surviving on emotional leftovers for years. Michael suggested we meet again. Not secretly. Not impulsively. Simply because he would be in my city for work. I hesitated. Debated. I argued with myself until my chest felt tight. And then I agreed. We met in a small cafe downtown. Neutral territory. Public. When I saw him walk in, I didn't feel sparks. I felt recognition. Like meeting someone who spoke a language I had nearly forgotten. We talked for hours. About life choices. Regret. Aging. What it means to wake up one day and realize you've been loyal to everyone except yourself. At one point he said softly, "People think betrayal starts with touch. I think it starts with silence." That sentence landed heavier than any confession. Nothing physical happened. No hands brushed, no lines were crossed. But when I went home that night, I felt shaken. Because I knew something irreversible had occurred. Not between us. Within me. I looked at my husband sleeping beside me and felt a wave of grief. Not anger. Not resentment. Grief for the woman I had been when we met. And the woman I had slowly sacrificed to keep the peace. I realized I wasn't angry at him. I was angry at myself for believing endurance was the same as devotion. The following weeks were unbearable. I existed in two worlds. One familiar and muted. The other uncertain but vividly awake. Michael never pressured me. Never rushed. Never suggested anything inappropriate. Which somehow made everything harder. Because the choice was entirely mine. I began asking myself questions I had avoided my entire adult life. If nothing changes, can I live like this for another 20 years? If I leave, who will I become? And who will I disappoint? Is choosing myself an act of courage, or selfishness? I didn't have answers. Only the growing certainty that staying silent was no longer neutral. It was a decision. The night everything shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no fight, no revelation. Just a moment of brutal honesty with myself. I realized that even if I never touched Michael again, something had already changed forever. Because I had remembered what it felt like to be emotionally alive. And once you remember that, you cannot unremember it. In the next part, I'll tell you about the decision I made. Not out of passion but out of self-respect. And how the consequences were nothing like I imagined. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't crossing a line. It's realizing you already have. After that night of realization, I expected things to settle. They didn't. Instead, my life began to feel like a room where the air was slowly thinning. Nothing dramatic changed on the surface, yet everything inside me was louder, heavier, impossible to ignore. I wasn't restless. I was resolute and terrified by it. Michael and I didn't meet again for weeks. Not because I asked for distance, but because I needed to know whether the shift inside me was dependent on him, or independent of him. I needed to understand whether he was the catalyst, or merely the mirror. So I stepped back. I stopped initiating conversations. I slowed my responses. I paid close attention to what I felt in the silence. What I discovered unsettled me. They didn't fade. Clarified. I didn't miss him the way people miss a lover. I missed the version of myself that existed when I spoke without editing. When my thoughts weren't immediately filtered through responsibility. Michael hadn't created that woman. He had simply recognized her. At home, the contrast became impossible to ignore. My husband and I continued our routine with practiced efficiency. Grocery lists. Bills. Family obligations. Dinner at the same time every night. We were partners in logistics, flawless. But intimacy had become theoretical. Something we spoke about in the abstract, like a concept that once applied to us but no longer did. I realized we hadn't argued in years. Not because we were aligned, but because neither of us expected to be understood. One evening after dinner, I asked him a question I had avoided for decades. Do you ever feel like we stopped choosing each other? He looked genuinely surprised, then thoughtful, then tired. He said, I think we chose stability. Isn't that the same thing? I wanted to say yes, but my body rejected the lie before my mouth could form it. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how women are praised for endurance. How we are taught that sacrifice is noble, that wanting more is dangerous, that restlessness is a flaw. No one ever tells you that loyalty to a life that no longer fits can become a slow betrayal of self. Michael reached out the next day. Not with longing. Not with urgency. Just a simple message. I hope you're being kind to yourself. That was all. And it broke something open. Because kindness had never been part of my internal language. We met again, this time intentionally. Not as an accident. Not as a coincidence. But as two adults acknowledging a truth neither wanted to romanticize. We walked instead of sitting. Movement made honesty easier. I told him everything. Not about my marriage details, but about my fear. Fear of hurting people. Fear of regret. Fear of becoming someone I didn't recognize. He listened. Then he said something that changed the way I viewed choice forever. Staying isn't morally superior if it costs you your integrity. I had spent my life believing the opposite. I began therapy shortly after. Not to justify leaving. Not to prepare for betrayal. But to finally understand myself without judgment. I learned that my numbness wasn't contentment. It was self-protection. I learned that desire doesn't disappear. It waits. And when it returns, it doesn't ask politely. The hardest realization came quietly. I wasn't choosing between two men. I was choosing between two versions of my future. One predictable and emotionally quiet. The other uncertain but honest. And uncertainty terrified me less than erasure. I told my husband I needed space. Not separation. Not divorce. Just space to think clearly. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply looked at me and said, "I didn't know you were this unhappy." And that hurt more than anger ever could. Because it meant I had hidden myself too well. Michael and I agreed on boundaries. No physical intimacy. No promises. No plans. Just truth. And in that truth, something unexpected happened. The urgency faded. The clarity deepened. I wasn't being pulled. I was choosing. What I didn't know then was that the real test wasn't desire. It was consequence. Because awareness is gentle compared to action. And in the next part, I'll tell you about the moment I crossed from contemplation into commitment, and how the cost of honesty was higher and more liberating than I ever imagined. Because freedom doesn't arrive quietly. It demands to be paid for in courage. There is a strange calm that comes before everything breaks. Not peace. Not relief. A stillness so deep it feels like standing at the edge of a frozen lake, knowing the ice beneath you is thinning, and choosing to step forward anyway. That was where I was.
Asking for space didn't give me answers. It gave me silence. And in that silence, I could no longer hide behind confusion. I saw my marriage clearly, not as a failure, not as a tragedy, but as a chapter that had completed its purpose long before I noticed. We had grown side by side, not together. And somewhere along the way, I had mistaken coexistence for intimacy. Living separately, even temporarily, was disorienting. I rented a small furnished apartment across town. Neutral walls, minimal furniture, and memories embedded in the corners. For the first time in decades, every object around me belonged to me, not to us, not to family history, not to compromise. The quiet was terrifying. And intoxicating. At first, I filled my days with productivity. Work, appointments, long walks. Anything to avoid sitting still with my emotions. But emotions are patient. They wait until you stop running. I miss my husband in unexpected ways. Not romantically, but ritualistically. The sound of him unlocking the door, the familiarity of his presence in the next room, the shared history that required no explanation. Grief doesn't only come from loss. It comes from release. Michael and I spoke sparingly. Intentional restraint. We didn't want to confuse clarity with excitement. But every conversation stripped away another layer of denial. We didn't talk about us. We talked about truth. About aging. About regret. About the terrifying freedom of choosing differently at 50. He never asked me to leave my marriage. And that made his presence heavier, not lighter. Because the choice remained entirely mine. One evening, after a particularly difficult therapy session, I asked myself a question I had avoided my entire life. If no one would be hurt, what would I choose? The answer came immediately. And it scared me, because it meant I already knew. I told my husband I wanted a separation. Not to punish, not to test, but because returning felt dishonest. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He went quiet, the kind of quiet that signals shock rather than acceptance. Then he said something I will carry forever. I thought we had time.
So did I.
But time isn't guaranteed. Presence is. Telling our family was worse. I watched their faces shift from confusion to concern to judgment, sometimes all at once.
Some were kind.
Some were disappointed. Some couldn't understand how a woman with everything could want more. I didn't try to explain, because explanations often sound like excuses to people who aren't listening. Loneliness arrived in waves. Not dramatic. Not overwhelming. Just persistent. Late at night, early mornings, moments when I reached for a life that was no longer there. And yet, beneath it all, there was something new. Alignment. Michael and I finally acknowledged what we had been circling. Not love. Not a future. But connection that mattered. We agreed to move slowly, painfully slowly. No fantasy. No escape narratives. Just presence. And with that presence came a new kind of fear. Because now the consequences were real. I began to understand how women my age become invisible, not because we disappear, but because society is uncomfortable with our awakening. We are expected to settle into gratitude. Not curiosity. Not desire. Certainly not reinvention. I realized how radical it is for a woman at 50 to choose herself, not recklessly, not impulsively, but deliberately. The weight of responsibility didn't vanish. I still worried about hurting people, about making the wrong choice, about waking up one day and realizing I had destroyed something irreplaceable. But I also realized something equally important. Staying out of fear is also a choice. One with consequences just as permanent. There were nights I cried without knowing exactly why. Not sadness. Release. Decades of restraint leaving my body slowly, painfully, honestly. I wasn't becoming someone new. I was remembering someone old. The final moment of certainty didn't arrive dramatically. It came quietly. One morning, standing alone in my kitchen, coffee cooling in my hands, I felt something unfamiliar.
Peace.
Not happiness. Not excitement. Peace rooted in alignment. And I knew whatever came next, I could live with it. In the next part, I'll tell you about the moment my choices collided, when truth demanded visibility, and when the cost of authenticity became undeniable. Because freedom isn't gentle, and courage doesn't arrive without consequence. And this part of my story is about collision, when the life you are choosing finally meets the life you are leaving, and neither allows you to pretend anymore. There is a moment when private truth demands public acknowledgement. You can delay it, you can soften it, you can try to manage it carefully, but you cannot avoid it forever. And when it arrives, it does not ask if you are ready. I thought I had already faced the hardest part. I was wrong. The hardest part wasn't choosing myself. It was watching that choice ripple outward, touching people who had never asked to be part of my awakening. The separation became real the day we told our children. No rehearsed speech prepares you for the sound of disappointment layered with confusion. They didn't accuse me. They didn't yell. They asked questions instead, the kind that cut deeper because they come from innocence. Did he do something wrong? Did you stop loving him? Were you unhappy this whole time? I tried to answer honestly, without burdening them with truths they weren't ready to carry. But honesty is a fragile balance. Say too much, and you wound. Say too little, and you lie. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and felt the full weight of my decision. Not guilt. Responsibility. The understanding that growth does not erase consequence. It absorbs it. Michael became both a refuge and a reminder. With him, I felt seen. With him, I felt awake. But I was acutely aware of the danger of confusing connection with escape. So we continued slowly. Painfully slowly. Sometimes unbearably so. Because anything rushed would have turned meaning into distraction. There were moments when doubt screamed louder than desire. Moments when I missed the predictability of my old life. Moments when I wondered if comfort had been enough, if I had been foolish to ask for more. And then there were moments when I remembered what numbness felt like. And the doubt quieted. People began to notice the change in me, not because I announced anything, but because I stood differently, spoke differently, no longer apologizing for existing in my own skin. Some responded with curiosity, others with suspicion. A woman who changes after 50 makes people uneasy. because she disrupts the narrative that time is meant to shrink us. My husband and I met one final time, not to reconcile, not to negotiate, but to acknowledge. We talked about memories without bitterness, about gratitude without obligation, and about letting go without erasing what had been real. He said something that surprised me. I don't think either of us failed. I think we stayed longer than we knew how. That sentence freed something in both of us. The legal process was clean. The emotional process was not. There were nights when loneliness pressed against my chest like a physical weight. Not longing for him. Longing for familiarity. For the life where my role had been clearly defined. Freedom is exhilarating.
But it is also disorienting.
Michael and I crossed a line eventually. Not impulsively. Not dramatically. But intentionally. And it was nothing like fantasy. It was quiet. Grounded. Almost reverent. Because when you arrive at intimacy after honesty, it carries weight. Not promise. Presence. Yet even then, I knew this story wasn't about him.
He was part of it.
But not its purpose. This was about agency. About learning that desire doesn't make you reckless, denial does. About understanding that choosing yourself later in life isn't indulgent. It's courageous. There were consequences I couldn't escape. Friendships that cooled. Judgments whispered behind polite smiles. The subtle repositioning of people who no longer knew where I fit. I learned that independence is lonely before it becomes empowering. But something remarkable happened. I began to trust myself. Not blindly,
but deeply.
I stopped asking for permission from society, from fear, from the version of myself that believed endurance was the highest virtue. I had endured enough. The woman I was becoming wasn't softer. She was clearer. And clarity, I learned, is what actually scares people. Because it cannot be manipulated. In the next part, I'll tell you about the aftermath. The quiet months after the storm, when no one is watching anymore, and when you must learn how to live inside the life you fought to choose. Because transformation doesn't end with courage. It begins with responsibility. The world moves on faster than you do. That was the first thing I noticed. People stop asking questions, the shock fades, your choices become old news. And suddenly, you're no longer the woman making a brave decision. You're just the woman who has already made it. That's when the real work begins. There is no applause for alignment. No ceremony for emotional honesty. You wake up each morning and realize that freedom does not feel like fireworks. It feels like responsibility. My days became strangely quiet. Not empty, just unscripted. No one expected me at a certain time, and no one needed explanations for my moods, and no one relied on me to maintain emotional equilibrium. At first, the silence felt like abandonment. Then it felt like space. I learned quickly that independence exposes everything you've avoided. Without roles to hide behind, your habits come into focus. The way you reach for distraction, the way you fill loneliness with productivity, the way you confuse movement with meaning. I had spent decades being necessary. Now, I had to learn how to be present. Michael and I continued seeing each other, but differently. The urgency was gone. So was the illusion. We had crossed into something quieter and more deliberate. We talked about expectations, about fear, about the danger of turning connection into identity. There was no promise of permanence. And oddly enough, that made it more honest. I realized how often women are taught to tether their worth to usefulness. Wife, mother, caregiver, mediator. When those roles loosen, something unsettling happens. You have to ask yourself who you are when no one needs you to perform. That question terrified me more than divorce ever did. There were nights when doubt returned uninvited. Not about my decision, but about myself. Was I strong enough to sustain this life without external validation? Was clarity enough to carry me through loneliness? Was freedom sustainable without guilt? These weren't questions with immediate answers. They were questions that demanded patience. I began to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. I stopped numbing myself with noise. I allowed sadness without narrative, loneliness without judgment, joy without justification. This was harder than endurance had ever been. Because endurance has structure. Presence does not. My relationship with my body changed. For the first time, I listened to it. Its fatigue, its desire, its resistance. I stopped treating age like a countdown. I stopped apologizing for visibility. I began to inhabit myself fully, not loudly, not performatively, but truthfully. And that quiet confidence unsettled people. Friends reacted in unexpected ways. Some leaned closer. Others pulled away. Not out of cruelty, but because my clarity reflected questions they weren't ready to ask themselves. I learned that growth doesn't isolate you. It reveals alignment. Michael and I faced our first real test. Not betrayal,
Not conflict.
but divergence. Our futures didn't align neatly. And instead of forcing compatibility, we spoke honestly. We acknowledged affection without obligation, connection without ownership. And for the first time in my life, I didn't equate love with sacrifice. That realization alone was worth everything I had lost. There were days I mourned the simplicity of certainty. Days when choice felt heavy. Days when I missed being told who I was supposed to be. But those days passed. And in their place came something steadier. Trust. I trusted myself to handle regret if it came. I trusted myself to rebuild if something ended. I trusted myself to survive uncertainty without retreating into numbness. This trust wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It settled into my bones quietly. One afternoon, while walking alone through a park, I watched a woman older than me laughing freely. Not performative laughter. Uncontained laughter. And something inside me softened. I realized aging doesn't shrink us. Fear does. I stopped asking whether my choice had been worth it. That question assumes life is transactional. Instead, I asked a better one. Am I living honestly? And for the first time, the answer was uncomplicated. Yes. The most unexpected gift of this chapter wasn't love. It was authorship. I was no longer a supporting character in my own life. I was the narrator. Even when the story was quiet. Even when the plot was uncertain. Even when no one was watching. In the next and final part, I'll tell you about what remains. Not the drama, not the romance, but the meaning that emerges when you stop chasing transformation and begin inhabiting it. Because the truest endings don't feel like closure. They feel like belonging. When people hear my story, they often ask the same question. Was it worth it? They mean the marriage, the separation, the loneliness, the judgment, the uncertainty. They want a clean answer. Yes or no. But life doesn't work that way. What I learned is this. Worth isn't something you calculate afterward. It's something you feel while you're living. And for the first time in decades, I feel aligned. Not euphoric, not endlessly happy. Aligned. My life now is not extraordinary. There are no grand gestures. No dramatic love story to replace the old one. No version of me that suddenly looks younger, freer, or more impressive from the outside. What changed is internal. And that change is irreversible. I wake up without the heaviness I once mistook for normal.
I don't dread the day.
I don't rehearse conversations in my head before they happen. I don't shrink my thoughts to keep the peace. That alone feels radical. I live alone.
That sentence used to terrify me.
Now it feels factual, neutral, even grounding. My home is quiet, but not empty. There is music when I want it. Silence when I need it. Nothing demands my emotional labor unless I choose to give it. And I didn't realize how exhausted I had been until that exhaustion lifted. Michael is no longer in my life. Not because of conflict, not because of betrayal, but because our paths had done what they needed to do. He was never meant to be my future. He was my interruption. The pause that forced me to hear myself again. And I will always respect him for that. We didn't promise forever. We promised honesty. And honesty sometimes means letting go without resentment. My relationship with my children has changed slowly, carefully. There were moments of distance. Moments of disappointment. Moments when they looked at me not as a mother, but as a woman who made a choice they didn't understand. I didn't defend myself. I didn't justify. I stayed consistent. Present. Over time, that mattered more than explanations. I've learned that being misunderstood is part of choosing yourself, especially as a woman, especially at this age. Society is comfortable with women who sacrifice quietly. It is less comfortable with women who wake up. I see it now everywhere. In conversations, in glances, in the subtle shift when people realize I am no longer asking for approval. Some admire it. Some resent it. Most don't know what to do with it. And that's not my responsibility anymore. I no longer define success by stability alone, or by longevity, or by how long something lasts. Some things are meant to end not because they failed, but because they were complete. That idea took me 50 years to accept. Do I miss my old life? Sometimes. But I don't confuse nostalgia with truth. I miss the familiarity, not the silence. I miss the structure, not the numbness. And whenever doubt tries to rewrite the past, I remind myself how much effort it took just to feel back then. Now, feeling comes naturally. Sadness passes through without staying. Joy doesn't require permission. Loneliness doesn't scare me. It sits with me, then leaves. I don't chase distractions to outrun myself anymore. I stay. Aging, I've learned, is not about loss. It's about refinement. You stop pretending. You stop explaining. You stop performing a version of yourself that no longer fits. And in that stripping away, something solid remains. I don't know what the next decade will bring. Love may return, or it may not. My life may change again, or it may settle into something even quieter. But whatever comes, I know this. I will not abandon myself again. If you are listening to this and wondering whether it's too late, it isn't. Not to leave.
Not to stay.
Not to change everything. Not to change one small thing. It's only too late when you stop listening. This story isn't an invitation to make reckless choices. It's an invitation to make honest ones. To ask yourself where you are enduring out of habit, where you are silent out of fear, where you are shrinking out of loyalty to a version of life that no longer needs you. At 50, I didn't reinvent myself. I reclaimed myself, and that required more courage than any dramatic escape ever could. This was my confession, not because I needed forgiveness, but because truth deserves to be spoken, even softly, especially softly. And for the first time in my life, I am not whispering anymore.